Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started in just a minute. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started here in just a minute, letting folks roll in. And Derek, just confirming that recording has started.
Correct.
Thank you.
When you said, Steve, that we're letting people roll in, I thought maybe we should have like an intro song to the webinar. What do you think?
You're welcome to sing, Gabe.
Like roll up, like something, like a 2000s hip hop sort of intro to the webinar.
For those of you who are on already, we do have a member of the Joint Office staff who does sing for us occasionally.
That's right, John Smart. He's not a great singer, but he's an exceptional performer. Maybe we'll have him record our intro track for webinars going forward.
Well, there's a proposal.
Yes.
And for those of you joining us, we are just bantering a bit here before we get started. We'll give everyone another minute. We'll start 2 after the hour, but thank you for joining us.
We can judge if we're doing well in our banter by how many people leave or come into. I saw actually when I was speaking, we lost one person, went down one.
It was definitely you, not me.
Oh, it was definitely me.
Great. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Steve Lomley. I'm the Communications and Education Manager for the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. And today's webinar is focused on the state of practice in DC charging. We're going to be talking with some panelists who are going to be sharing some information on how they're approaching site evaluation and deployment for the NEVI Formula program. So just a quick couple of housekeeping tips here before we go ahead and get started. We are going to be taking question and answer via the chat feature or via the Q&A feature on Zoom. So there is a chat feature as well as a Q&A, and we do ask that you use the Q&A to submit questions. It makes it a lot easier for us to track. And if you hover over the Q&A or at the bottom of your screen, you can open up that Q&A. We'll be addressing those here later on. And then I did want to let you all know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Joint Office website or used internally. So just a disclaimer that if you're speaking during the webinar or using video, you are presumed to consent to recording and use of your video or image. So on today's webinar, we're going to give you just a quick overview of the Joint Office. I'm going to introduce you to Gabe Klein, our Executive Director, and then we'll hear from the Colorado Energy Office, followed by Pennsylvania DOT, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So with that, I want to turn over to Gabe Klein. Gabe Klein is the Executive Director of the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. Joined us last September, I believe, and comes from previous background working for the Chicago Department of Transportation and the Washington, D.C. District of Transportation, experience in private sector as well, working on car share, background in non-motorized mobility, bicycles, that kind of thing. So Gabe's a real asset to the Joint Office, and we really appreciate having him on board. So Gabe, turn it to you to say a few words.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you and all the team members that put this together. We are really working hard to have more proactive technical assistance and outreach so that we can answer many more people's questions and then hopefully get down into the more detailed, granular questions and uncover those. We appreciate all of you that are on, taking time out of your Tuesday to join us and to hear from this great group discussing the important considerations when evaluating sites for EV charging stations. And I would say that Colorado and their energy office and the Pennsylvania DOT are 2 leaders in the space. So we're very excited to hear from states who have actually implemented and are working and planning on implementing many more DC fast charging stations and the programs that they've developed to further or to support the further deployment. We're going to not just learn about successes, we're going to learn about challenges too. This is new for many of us, particularly if you're on the transportation side of the equation, whether you're in a city or a state or an MPO. And just so you know, we in the Joint Office, Steve, me, the entire team, which is growing, by the way, and feel free to look at our website for open jobs. We're really working hard to accelerate this electrified multimodal transportation system. It needs to be convenient, reliable, affordable, accessible, and equitable. And as I keep repeating to our team, it needs to be frictionless, which means it needs to really work well for everybody all the time. And it's going to take a lot of regional and local coordination. So while we represent the federal government and this national program, we know that it's you all locally and regionally that are going to make it happen. And we're here to support you. Feel free to go to our website and ask questions. There's 20 people there behind the website at driveelectric.gov to answer those questions. Thanks, everybody. And back to you, Steve.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabe. And again, welcome to all of you for joining us. Just a quick overview of our panelists for today. So first we have Christian Willis. Christian comes from the Colorado Energy Office, and he's the Managing Director of Transportation Fuels and Technology at the Energy Office, where he leads efforts to accelerate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles through policy planning and research, as well as management of statewide infrastructure and e-mobility grant programs, and supporting education and outreach. He previously served as Director of Programs and Initiatives, where he oversaw a team of program managers and engineers responsible for managing existing programs and launching new initiatives in the energy efficiency and alternative fuels market. And then we also have Natasha Fackler and Colton Brown from PennDOT. So Natasha serves as PennDOT's Infrastructure Implementation Coordinator, and she advises the Governor's Office and PennDOT to develop practices on the use of, receipt of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Program funds. She also designated as the state's lead point of contact for the NEVI formula program to guide investments in electrification across the Commonwealth. And prior to taking on that role, she served as PennDOT's policy director and has over 25 years of experience in Pennsylvania. Colton is the newly credited Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Coordinator for PennDOT, where he supports the development and implementation of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Grant Program and leads electric vehicle education initiatives. Previously, Colton worked for the Commonwealth to manage Level 2 and DC fast charging program funds. So with that, very excited for our panelists today, and did want to note, the Joint Office has convened these panelists to share information. We're not necessarily endorsing specific recommendations that they're making, but they are subject matter experts who do have valuable insights to share. And so we appreciate them being here and sharing that with us today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Christian, who will share his screen and begin sharing Colorado's experience.
All right, just making sure that I'm doing the right screen, Steve. All right, how does that look?
Looks great, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, well, again, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Really excited to share the work that we're doing in Colorado. My name is Christian Willis. I'm the Managing Director for Transportation Fuels and Technology and lead our transportation team at the Energy Office. So as part of my presentation today, I'm going to start by just talking really briefly about our electric vehicle goal and what we've established as the infrastructure need in Colorado. I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about our existing programs because I think you'll see a lot of what we've done in existing and past programming really influences the way that we're approaching the NEVI funding. And then I'll spend the rest of the time talking about our NEVI deployment efforts, as well as the solicitation that we released a couple of weeks ago. So back in 2018, we set a really aggressive goal as part of our initial Colorado electric vehicle plan. And that goal is 940,000 light-duty electric vehicles on the road by 2030. I really like to show this chart here because it gives you a good sense of what the year-over-year growth in electric vehicles really needs to look like in Colorado in order for us to meet that aggressive goal, as well as a 70% EV market share for new vehicle sales in 2030, Right now in Colorado, we're at about 80,000 electric vehicles. So we're on track, but you can see from this chart that starting in about 2025, those year-over-year sales really start to increase. We do feel that with the right mix of policy and program strategies, we can meet this aggressive goal. And it really starts with making sure that we have enough infrastructure on the ground to accommodate all of these new electric vehicles. So we did an analysis a couple of years ago where we looked at what sort of infrastructure would be needed to meet that 2030 goal, both in terms of the number of charging stations, the type of charging stations, the locations that these stations need to go. And as you can see on the left table there, by 2030, to meet that high growth scenario, we're looking at about 5,000 DC fast charging ports across the state, with about 1,100 of those being along our corridors. Right now, we have about 800 ports, so we're making good progress, but we clearly have a long ways to go. You can see on the map on the right side, hopefully that's coming through clearly, but this gives you a sense of the concentration of the number of charging stations needed in each county. And so in the central northern part of the state, that's the Denver metro area, the urban Front Range. You can see that the concentration is much greater. And that means we need not only a lot of corridor stations, but a lot of community DC fast charging as well. And then when we get out into the more rural parts of the state, you can see the concentration is much lower, really focused on corridor charging that enables long distance travel, as opposed to a lot of community-based community-based DC fast charging. So I want to talk just for a minute about our existing programs. I'll note, though, that last program on the list, that's Fleet Zero, that's a program that's really focused on providing charging to help electrify medium and heavy duty fleets in Colorado. That's something that we're working on and will launch later this spring. So I'm really focused on these first three programs here. And the first is Charge Ahead Colorado. That's a program we launched in 2013. Designed to provide grants for community-based level 2 and DC fast charging stations across the state, really designed to provide grants for the kinds of charging that people need to feel confident in meeting their daily driving needs in an electric vehicle. In 2018, we launched the Corridors program, designed to install high-speed charging along our major transportation corridors, providing confidence to the driving public that they can get anywhere in the state in an electric vehicle. And then in 2020, we launched our Plazas program, kind of a hybrid of the two. So high-speed charging, but in communities as well as along our transportation corridors across the state. So I'll talk for just a minute about Charge Ahead Colorado. Again, this is really focused on community-based level 2 and DC fast charging stations. I should note that, typically what we see here in terms of DC fast charging is smaller or lower power levels and smaller numbers as compared to the NEVI program. We do run a competitive grant program. We do 3 rounds per year. And then last fall, we actually opened up a new rolling grant cycle for projects that we really consider high priority projects. So workplaces, multifamily housing, and for projects that are looking at 3 or fewer stations. And the idea here really is giving these high priority applicants the ability to apply anytime, and we think get money out the door quickly and get stations built more quickly. In terms of incentives, we provide a percentage of project cost up to a cap, typically 80%. And we think that helps to constrain costs that are incurred by the state. But we also launched last fall some enhanced incentives that are really designed to drive more investment into disproportionately impacted communities. And I'll talk about this more in a few minutes. And then I just wanted to note that these types of projects tend to be lower cost, smaller scale, and shorter duration than what we're seeing as part of the NEVI program requirements. We think those are going to be, of course, much more costly and take longer. However, we're even seeing with some of these relatively simple projects, costs going up, timelines extending. So we think that there's a caution there for the way in which we implement our NEVI programming. And then I would just note that to date, we've funded over 2,000 stations across Colorado with this program. And I think what I want to leave with this slide is that we've really tested a lot of the programmatic strategies, the incentive strategies that we've carried along to future programs, including our approach to NEVI. And then with our corridor program, as I mentioned, we launched this in 2018. You can see from the map on the upper part of the slide there that we established 6 different corridors across the state and 34 locations. And this is a little bit different than our typical program. We actually identified the locations that we wanted charging. And then we required applicants to bid on an entire corridor. And the idea there was each corridor was a mix of stations that were anticipated to see more utilization early on, as well as lower utilization, helping to create a reasonable business case for an entire corridor. And a lot of the specs for this program, I think, are similar to what we're seeing with NEVI. So we did require that each project be in close proximity to a highway interchange. We required that each project be in close proximity to amenities, and we required 24/7 access. In terms of the technical specs, we required each location to have at least 2 or 4 ports per site. So 2 ports in the rural parts of the state, 4 ports in the urban parts of Colorado, as well as the interstates. And then we required that each port be capable of providing at least 50 kilowatts of charging for each vehicle plugged in simultaneously, and then using power sharing to provide a minimum of 150 kW if only charging 1 vehicle at a time. And then we did require modular design so that stations could be easily upgraded as the market evolved and higher power or higher charging vehicles are introduced to the market. And then one more thing that I would note is that we did require pretty prescriptive future proofing. We wanted to make sure that each of these sites could be doubled in size as the market grew. So we required that each site have enough real estate for double the number of chargers, that they implement future proofing strategies like extra conduit and pre-wiring and concrete pads. And then the electrical capacity had to be capable of delivering electricity to those additional stations at a rate of 350 kilowatts when using power sharing. Again, we have the grant approach of 80 to 90% of project cost up to a cap. And then we now have 30 locations open with full completion of the program anticipated by the end of the year. And so I would just note, for those of you keeping track, we launched this program in 2018. It is 2023, and we're not yet done. So these projects take a really long time to get through or to get complete. COVID didn't do us any favors, but they are very complicated projects, and they take quite a long time. And then the last thing I'll note on this slide is if you look at the pie chart in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the kinds of site hosts that are participating in this program. So we have 12 local governments that are serving as site hosts, 8 fueling and convenience stores, and then a mix between retail, lodging, and dining site hosts. And then lastly, just want to talk about our DC fast charging plazas program. This is the program through which we're going to deploy the majority of our funding. So again, this was really designed to provide high-speed charging to drivers that don't have access to home charging or workplace charging, as well as for high-mileage fleets like Lyft and Uber. And then we recently opened it up to also provide funding to fill gaps along our transportation corridors. And so initially, this was really urban focused. So we were looking at putting stations near high density areas like downtown, commercial developments, transit hubs, and then again, opened it up so that we could begin to fill some of the gaps that weren't covered by our corridor program. We maintained a lot of the technical requirements from the corridors program, but it is more streamlined so that it's easier for our applicants to participate. And then I'll talk more about lessons learned over the next few slides, but we've incorporated a lot of lessons learned from the corridors program and previous funding rounds. And we continue to iterate this program on an ongoing basis. And then lastly, we are incorporating NEVI funding, but we also have state funding that we'll be distributing through this grant cycle as well. So I'm here to talk primarily about NEVI and corridor funding, but just note that we will also be providing funding for community-based DC fast charging plazas through this funding round and this RFA, request for applications, that I'll be talking about. And we've updated to include all of the NEVI requirements like Buy America, the workforce certifications like EVITP, and then the enhanced data collection requirements that we've seen in the final guidelines. And so I do want to switch gears and talk just a little bit about lessons learned, because they really influence a lot of what you'll hear in the rest of my comments. And I'll start with siting deployment. And I think we have found that we can really use creative incentives and evaluation criteria that help to achieve the policy and program goals of the state. And so I'll talk about incentives in a minute, but really focused on how do we use incentives to drive the kinds of investments that we want to see in Colorado charging. as well as how do we create incentives that help to increase viability, improve the business case so that we see charging all over the state and are really effective at filling those gaps. We think it's really important to allow for a variety of business models, including multi-party arrangements. So when we launched the Corridors program, for instance, we thought that every site would have two parties, the grantee and the site host. But we found over time that there's a lot of risk in installing some of these stations, and we really needed a third-party owner-operator that could bring additional capital to the project and to de-risk the project for those involved. So we actually have a number of projects in that corridor program that have multi-party arrangements. And then this is something that we've sort of learned the hard way, recognizing that limited due diligence can be completed by applicants prior to award. So it's really unlikely that when somebody submits a proposal that they have a final site host agreement. They probably have not submitted a utility application. They probably haven't applied for permitting. So there's going to be some level of uncertainty in each project before you have issued a contract to the grantee. And then lastly on this slide, we have found that, there are some optimal sites out there, but by and large, it's really balancing different criteria like filling a charging gap, finding a willing site host, finding a site that meets the site characteristics that are important, like proximity to amenities, and then doing it at a reasonable project cost. And sometimes all those things come together, but sometimes it's a couple and not all. And so, I'll show this example on the right side. This is a corridor in Western Colorado. You can see with the red hash marks, that's the 50-mile gap. And we have one population center there, and it's a very small community in Western Colorado. Now, we haven't seen a proposal from that community, so we don't know what's possible, but it's highly likely that we meet some, but not all of the criteria that we're looking for, just because we've got a limited opportunity there. And then if you contrast that with this map on the left side, this is some really neat mapping that CDOT did for us as we started to think about our corridor planning. And you can see with this gap, there are actually quite a few population centers. And in the purple shaded area, that's a Justice 40 community. So the hope would be that between all these population centers, we can find something that checks the boxes. And then lastly, I like to talk about this map here because I think it was a real world example of us struggling to balance these different competing priorities. This is a community in Southern Colorado. We actually got an application for this community, but it was on the very outskirts of town. So we found a willing site host. We filled a gap, but it wasn't close to proximities, and it missed what we think is an opportunity with this investment, which is economic development. And so wherever possible, we really like to see these stations sited in a community's main street where, when somebody's charging, they can get out, they can buy a cup of coffee, they can stop at a restaurant, maybe pop into a store. And so looking at how do we also use this to achieve other goals beyond just filling gaps. And so we ultimately decided against funding this project in hopes that we could encourage a site host along that main street to submit an application. And then just a couple more things on lesson learned. I think if you've taken away anything from my previous comments here, it's an evolving market. Things are changing. There's some level of uncertainty when it comes to these projects. So just making sure that you're building flexibility and continuous improvement into your program design, your program administration, and in the projects themselves. Excuse me, I'll talk in a few minutes about how we are using some reimbursement strategies to increase uptime and reliability. You've heard me mention that you ought to prepare for longer project timelines. We're assuming that these projects are probably going to take about 18 to 24 months, and that doesn't include actually putting our solicitation out on the streets and then contracting. And then I think Colorado might be a little bit unique in this case, but we did not submit any exceptions in our original NEVI plan. We're seeing in Colorado, the market is rapidly evolving. Places that are gaps today may not be considered a gap a couple of years from now. We're seeing new entrants come to the market and wanting to invest in rural parts of the state. So I think for us, it's really important to let the market determine where the true gaps are. So we're not likely to apply for any exceptions for a number of rounds because we do think we'll have success filling a lot of those gaps. Okay, so We submitted our NEVI plan like every other state. I think Colorado was a little unique in that we ended up requesting a number of new designated corridors. So we went from 8 corridors before the last round of nominations to 14 now. And our thinking there was we really wanted to be able to allocate funding on every corridor across the state beginning on day one. We really wanted to make sure that we could open up all areas of Colorado to transportation electrification. And so to that end, we're really focused on filling corridor gaps, particularly those that are in disproportionately impacted communities, followed by expanding those existing stations that I mentioned a few minutes ago along those designated corridors where it's cost effective to upgrade to meet those NEVI requirements. We certainly have the areas where we've got charging today, but it's insufficient to meet the market demand. So we'll consider those proposals. And then finally, it may be a year or two before we see a lot of interest in public charging for medium and heavy duty, but we want to make sure we keep our options open to provide funding to help electrify medium and heavy duty fleets in Colorado by funding the kinds of public infrastructure that's going to be needed. Okay, so now I'm really digging into our most recent solicitation. On the right side here, you can see this is a chart showing all of the incentives that are available through our Plazas program. And you can see in part, the idea here is to be responsive to the proposals that come into the market, but really drive investment, as I've said, where it's most needed. And so if you go midway down that chart, you can see that we've got incentives for disproportionately impacted and disadvantaged communities. We'll provide an additional $5,000 per charger for those chargers installed in these communities. We think this helps to increase access to those who have traditionally been left out of competitive grant programs and makes more attractive investing in these communities where there are charging deserts. So we've got new incentives. You'll see in a minute that we're also evaluating these proposals more favorably, and we'll do more targeted outreach to potential site hosts in this community. We also include tiered incentive levels. So if you look at that, the top part of the chart there, you'll see those are our base incentives for the 7-county metro area, the urban Front Range, and rural parts of the state. And the idea here is to stimulate investment across the state without over-investing. So we know, for instance, that in the Denver metro area, we actually don't need to provide 80% of project cost because site hosts will bring 50% or more match to the table. So that's what we'll provide, 50% of the cost of a project, up to $90,000 in this case per charger for the Denver metro area. In rural parts of the state, we still need that really generous incentive, so we will provide up to 80% of the project cost. And then finally, we do provide incentives for battery storage. We think this will really help to open up parts of the state that might not be open right now. We have a lot of rural corridors in Colorado where access to three-phase power isn't a given, and it may actually be much more cost effective and bring additional benefits if applicants are using battery storage rather than running a really expensive three-phase power line extension. And then we're also providing multi-site awards. So we think this will encourage applicants to provide or to submit proposals for 3 or more locations. Again, this is our idea or our approach to getting projects done more quickly, getting funding out the door more quickly. This is the evaluation criteria that we're going to be using. So these are the things that are important to Colorado in evaluating proposals. You can also see how we've weighted each of those criteria on the right side of that table. There are really 3 areas that I think are relevant to our topic today. So the first is plaza locations and access to amenities. And so we're looking here for things like, does the location fill a charging gap? Is it located in a disproportionately impacted community or Justice 40 community? Is it designed for safety in mind? So is there adequate area lighting? Are they putting the station on a site that is in close proximity to a building's entrance or where there's a reasonable level of activity? We want people to feel safe when charging their vehicles at these stations. And as I talked about earlier, are we providing opportunities for economic development? Secondly, we're looking at, is the site suitable for location of a DC fast charging station? And is it in close proximity to other stations? Particularly early on where we're really looking to fill these gaps, doesn't make a lot of sense to put a station in close to an existing DC fast charging station. Secondly, we're looking at plaza design, facilities facilities requirements and minimum station specs. Here, we're really interested in, is the site going to be designed to accommodate those with disabilities or in a wheelchair? And then finally, this is really where we're evaluating those sites that are investing in equity more favorably. We're looking at where is it located within a community? Is it in close proximity to multifamily housing? Have they done a meaningful effort to engage the community? Do they have letters of support from community-based organizations? We have put together a couple of resources for potential applicants that we think will make it easier for them to submit proposals. The first is a teaming partner list. So this allows those that are interested in helping to support a particular site to sign up and tell us who they are, what they have to offer, or what they're interested in. So it may be that a property owner who has a site that's available in a disproportionately impacted community along one of our corridors is interested in connecting with developers. And so we've got a long list of folks who are interested in being a partner to one of these projects, and we're hoping that we can do some matchmaking here. This map on the right is an interactive map that CDOT has put together for potential applicants, really allows them to get in and look at the communities where locations are available today, whether or not they meet NEVI requirements or if they could be upgraded. And then the shaded area there are areas in Colorado that are disproportionately impacted or Justice 40 communities. And then I just have a couple more slides. I did want to talk to our approach to reimbursement. Traditionally, we have only reimbursed at the very end of a project. So once the project was fully complete, we would reimburse the entire amount. We are interested in encouraging new applicants to our programming, and we know that these projects are going to be quite a bit more expensive than what we funded in the past. And because of those long timelines, we are moving to a milestone-based reimbursement approach. We think that will be helpful for applicants, but we also know that it introduces a little bit of risk to the state since we are providing funding before the station is done. So we are going to retain 20% at each milestone payment, and then we will pay all of the retainage for the milestones back once the project is complete. However, we are going to keep 5% of total project cost once that station is complete, so that we can ensure timely completion of reporting, required uptime, and continuous operation. And then we will provide 1% of that 5% each year over 5 years. And then lastly, this is just the communication that went out a couple of weeks ago launching this RFA. It went out to all of our grant program stakeholders, as well as those that have signed up to stay in touch about our NEVI programming. We have a link to our program webpage, to the CDOT resources I talked about a minute ago. We have a link to the application guide. We've also prepared an application in Word so that people can start working on their application before they submit it online. We have a formal Q&A period that ends tomorrow. All answers will be posted by the end of next week, as well as any potential changes to the RFA itself. And then we're keeping our RFA open for 60 days. It closes on May 5th. So I think with that, I'm done. Obviously happy to chat more and answer questions at the end of the formal presentations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christian. That was wonderful. And we will hopefully have a couple of minutes here at the end to take questions. At this point, I want to turn it over to Natasha and Colton from PennDOT.
All right, thank you. So hello, everyone. This is Colton Brown with PennDOT, going to provide an overview of PennDOT's NEVI program, and then Natasha will share some information about lessons learned that we've come across in planning for this program and developing it and getting it out there. And this is actually the first I'm seeing. I did not previously know that we have the same due date for the first round of our NEVI applications. So we'll get to that a little bit, but May 5th for both of us, I guess. All right, screen share is coming through, right?
Yes, looks good. Thanks, Colton.
Okay, thank you. All right, so many of us have seen this if we've seen different states talk about their NEVI programs. This is the snapshot of Pennsylvania's NEVI program. So we have 171 million over 5 years. The first 2 years of our funding that we have access to now is about 62 million. Of that, we anticipate about 56 million will be available for awards, with the remainder going to administration and other eligible project types through the NEVI program. we've gotten our state plan approved. We released our round 1 notice of funding opportunity in early January, and we later updated that to incorporate the final rule from FHWA. So this is Pennsylvania's alternative fuel corridors. It is largely our interstate highway network. We do also have 4 other major portions of 4 other major roadways designated. This amounts to over 1,800 miles of roadway. So we anticipate that it will take a minimum of 40 to 50 sites to reach that build out certification, the range being dependent upon whether there's sites that fulfill multiple interstates, such as being at the connections of multiple interstates. And then, potentially more sites than that along the interstates to build in redundancy, as that's one of the other goals of our NEVI program. So as mentioned, we have the first round of our program available. So at this point, we have our notice of funding opportunity out there. We're currently taking any technical questions that people have on it, and applications to the program will open on Monday. But our funding opportunity document has a variety of sections here that are listed, and we'll go into a little more detail on some of those components. So for our discussion here today in particular, much of it focuses on how are we choosing sites. So this right here, you see a small screenshot of a portion of our interactive map. What we've done is we have grouped each of Pennsylvania's interstate highways into what we call corridor groups. These corridor groups are give or take 25 miles each, with the goal of getting to that 25-mile redundancy, more than just the charging every 50 miles. And then each of these corridor groups we have designated as being a priority 1, 2, or 3. Priority 3 meaning that we already have that high-power DC fast charging station that we need to comply with the NEVI program. 4 ports, 150 kilowatt each, within a mile of the exit. Priority 2 meaning that we have a NEVI compliant site not too far away, and a priority 1 meaning that that is a large gap, and it would be very beneficial if we had a site in that corridor group for building out our highway network. So as part of our scoring and selection, we will first look to get a site within each of our priority 1 corridor groups, followed by a site within each of our priority 2 corridor groups. So I'm going to briefly pull over our interactive map so you can see the full thing. So this is all of our interstates, all of our corridor groups. As I said, that shows which sections of highway are competing with each other. Then if we zoom into each one of these bubbles, you can actually see the 1-mile polygon around each of the exits along the highway. So you can see the specific locations that are eligible to apply. So that tells you what locations are eligible. And then the large bubble tells you that everyone who applies to within one of those eligible locations is competing against each other for a single award through our program. Okay, so utility coordination is obviously a key component of these projects, and we see as being very important for project development and selecting sites that will be more likely to reach project completion. So we're requiring all of our applicants to submit this form to their electric utility in advance. The electric utility then completes it and sends it back to them. We've developed this form in consultation with our major utilities, and it's really designed to just provide a conceptual price and timeline for what the utility upgrade costs could be. We know that these projects are speculative, so we do not expect our utilities to be doing $10,000 of engineering on each of their sites to get a detailed cost estimate. But this can at least give both the applicant as well as us an idea of what work might be involved and what costs could be involved in timeline to be providing power to the sites. Furthermore, if after a project award, for any reason, maybe it's the utility connection cost turns out to be much higher than expected, or any other reason that a project could fall through, site host agreement or NEPA environmental approval, we have in our NOFO that we could go to our second highest ranked site within that corridor group and then offer them an award instead if the first selected project does not pan out. So here's our timeline. Highlights here, obviously, is that Monday is when we will open for applications. May 5th is when we close for applications. We're in a different time zones. We'll only be a couple hours off of Colorado there. We'll have some time for reviewing those applications, and then we hope to go through the environmental clearance and be getting to notice to proceed sometime this fall for our round 1 projects. So we've been very transparent with our scoring and selection process. This is the breakdown for the full 100 points. There's a number of scoring criteria in between or within many of these scoring items. And here you can see the full scoring rubric that we have for one of those. So this is our sustainability, equity, resilience, and economic development scoring category worth 12 points. And you can see exactly how much each question will be worth and how we will be scoring everyone as we work towards our project selections. So that was a quick snapshot. I will now turn it over to Natasha for some lessons we've learned along the way.
Thanks, Colton. So I love this slide, the herding cats image here for all of you. But when you think about your NEVI program, it really takes a lot of stakeholders to put forth a successful even just a launch of your funding opportunity within your state. And I won't read through all of these or highlight all these, but a couple of them I really want to focus on is first off, making sure you have engagement with your FHWA regional office. I was on a call yesterday with many of the state NEVI coordinators, and that seems to be one point where the different division offices are reviewing things differently and making sure that they understand what process you're going through, what ways that you are complying with Title 23. And for us, we knew that the division office was going to be really important in our conversation. So we actually included them on our core EV team that meets weekly. So that's just one that I wanted to highlight from the list. I know additionally for us, our sibling agencies, I know from Pennsylvania's perspective, understanding the alternative fuels tax and the ways the Department of Revenue is capturing that. Our DEP, which Colton previously worked at, really has been a good partner to us. We meet with them weekly to talk about lessons learned overall because they manage our Volkswagen settlement funds. Additionally on this list, as Colton mentioned, utilities are super important. But again, also just talking through who your stakeholders are and understanding their needs. I know as we put together our NEVI plan, initially, we spent countless hours and countless meetings meeting with stakeholders to make sure our program was one that those who would be applying for us were happy with the way that the program came out. So again, just making sure you're meeting with as many people as possible as you put together your program. Next slide. Some kind of general lessons learned, and I'm not going to read through these. We put a lot of information on the slides, more than we typically do, but really understanding what kind of program you want to put together. Obviously, new programs can be challenging to work through all the details to make sure you're understanding what process you want, who needs to be involved, what decisions need to be made as you put together that. And making sure that you're having plenty of time and most importantly, having the right people in the room to make decisions. I know for us, we initially started out having kind of a core team, which we expanded to involve more individuals within our agency to make sure that we had the right people in the room at the right time to help make decisions quickly so we could put together a thoughtful program. Next slide. I think this is an important one as well. When you think about the rules of engagement, Title 23 and the federal guidelines that came out officially, the federal rules, making sure that you are following that, but also making sure you're following the state rules that you have in place. I know for us as a state, we are not doing a procurement, we are doing a competitive grant. And so the rules for a procurement versus a grant are different. And our legal team has made sure that in everything that we say, we actually say that we're not doing a procurement because of those rules and parameters around that. As we were putting together our program, additionally, we had a lot of decisions to make on how many rounds of funding we wanted to do, what would be in those rounds of funding, and ways that we could make sure that the money that we have is really going towards the overall NEVI guidelines and parameters, knowing that they want a nationwide network to support travel on long distance, on interstates. So making sure that that was the focus of our initial rounds of funding was important to us. Next slide. Again, this one is way more words than I would prefer to be on the slide, but hopefully you can look at them later when you have time. But a couple of them I want to highlight. Again, Colton mentioned our utility form. That was something we thought was important. Knowing you can't put an EV site in without a utility, working with them on the form that we created, making sure they were part of that conversation, understanding what they need to know, plus what we would need to know to make sure we're making a good site decision. Also making sure in that program requirement, the first bullet there on the slide, making sure what you as a state want to identify as requirements above and beyond, maybe the federal guidelines, maybe they're the minimum standard. What do you want to do? Maybe that's a little more stringent or a little bit more above those kind of minimum guidelines from the federal government. Additionally, for us, I know in the application process, we had heard, as Colton mentioned, that everyone wanted us to be very transparent on how we were evaluating and scoring our projects. We've been very transparent in that. You can see for every single question in our NOFO, what points you can receive in that evaluation process. And we wanted applicants to know what ways they could improve their application just from reading those criteria and scoring rubric as well. So again, a lot of details on this slide. I know we're running short on time, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to operate or go through some of the questions here as well. So I'll go to our last slide, which I think is just our contact information. Again, we're happy to answer questions during the Q&A time period.
Great. Thanks so much, Natasha, Colton, and Christian. Really appreciate it. Colton, if you could stop sharing your screen here, we can all come back on. We do have a number of questions from panelists. And I think a kind of a common theme was just this something that you all touched on, was this idea of flexibility, understanding that grant applicants may reach out to utilities and collect information, but actually working with the utility to deploy a site can have challenges, and capacity can change quickly. Christian, you talked about permitting and how that can be a process as well. So like in practice, how does that flexibility work? Do you allow awardees to change the location slightly? Or I know, Natasha, you talked about potentially going with a secondary applicant. How does that all work in practice?
I'm happy to start. I can tell you that in the corridor program, our grantee came to the table with primary site hosts, secondary site hosts, tertiary site hosts, and in many cases we blew through all of those, trying to find a site host that was willing to bring match to the table, had the real estate requirements, were cost effective from a utility perspective. So we had to be extremely flexible in allowing them to identify another site host. I think we anticipate, we hope that we don't experience that same moving through multiple site hosts with our Plaza program. We are encouraging applicants to do more due diligence, but again, we still understand that there is some level of uncertainty. So there certainly is the opportunity to find an additional site host, although if we think it's going to take an extended amount of time, we might ask them to drop that site from the contract and then reapply in a future round when they've had the ability to do that extensive stakeholder or site due diligence.
Yeah, and I would add, I would just say there's kind of a couple pieces to dealing with it. One is what you ask for or require up front. So we are requiring everyone to basically describe to us what is their project team. So that will include, their site host, that will include who they would plan to use for equipment, for installation. If it's not a specific company, at least what sorts of requirements and terms they would put into an agreement, or who they'd be looking for. So some of it is, making sure that there already is this coordination among their team, and that everyone who's going to be part of the project is ready and willing. And then on the, and then after an award is when the flexibility and location can come in. I know, when I was working on our Volkswagen settlement fund programs, we did have some provisions that allowed for, minor location changes, still in the same, couple mile area. Had to make sure that it still would have checked out and been awarded a project if that was the originally proposed site. But we did have some projects that moved site occasionally. It's things are a little more complicated and stringent when you have federal funds involved. So we don't anticipate having a process like that for NEVI, but that's where our ability to, say, okay, this project fell through, we're going to go to, the next in line if we have another good project, so that we can make sure that we don't, lose out and delay getting our network built.
Great, thanks. There's a kind of another theme to some questions. I mean, you've identified locations that are priorities, and you kind of have expectations for those, but you may have proposers suggesting that they want to build more ports that could drive up the cost. They may want to make those stations accessible to medium duty, heavy duty vehicles, and that would be kind of a slightly different comparison to a station that was designed primarily for light duty vehicles. So kind of how do you factor in, or how do you allow those who are applying for grants to kind of be competitive when they may be proposing things that have like slightly different kind of value that they're offering to the end user?
Yeah, we do have some smaller, point categories for those sorts of things, having more ports, having a higher total power level, also having provision in there for medium and heavy duty. But we have really tailored our points and our focus on, the overarching goal of the NEVI program, which is initially, building out this interstate network for light duty vehicle charging. So that is our primary focus, but if they want to have some of those things as add-ons, we'll certainly award them for them, but it's not, that's kind of how we balance those.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think for us, we're very open to projects that are more than 4 ports, but I think what we're going to want to see a justification for that. Where, it's very common that we will see applications come in our other programs for more than seems appropriate for the use case. So we're really looking at did they right size the proposal for the identified use case, and so that's going to figure into whether or not we would choose to fund stations or ports more than the 4 port minimum.
Okay. And Christian, on one of your slides, you showed the various incentives that you were tacking on to some projects. What funds are you using for those? Do those all come out of NEVI, or do you have different buckets of funding that can be paired together?
We do have state funding as well. So, we anticipate that for projects that are along the designated corridors that are filling gaps, that's going to be primarily NEVI funding. But we do have state funds that are available for corridors that may not be designated, or projects in communities that might be more designed to serve those that don't have access to home charging or high mileage fleets, like I mentioned, Lyft or Uber. So we are fortunate to have a combination of funds, and we'll look to put stations along our corridors as well as within communities.
Got it. And Natasha, we had a follow-up question for you. Can you speak a little bit more to kind of that idea about how you chose competitive grants instead of a procurement process?
Sure. As a team, we had met with all of our program staff, our legal staff, and with our PA division office, and really knowing that we had a goal of getting our program up and running fast. The grant program seemed to us to be the fastest mechanism to get money back out the door and to build out our corridors. In Pennsylvania, we do have a P3 law, but it can take up to 2 years just to put out your P3 procurement. Again, our RFP process here in Pennsylvania can take upwards to 18 months as well. So the grant program for us seemed to be the one that we could move forward with and get projects out the door as soon as we could get the program up and running.
Yeah, and the other piece to that really weighed in favor of a competitive grant was that, PennDOT is not interested in owning or operating any of these stations. And like our state P3 law says that PennDOT has to take ownership of the project after it's completed. So competitive grant made sense from the perspective of supporting the private industry and getting these stations up and running and then letting them continue to operate them.
I'm going to get back to a question about utilities because I think you all kind of suggested that proposers have to coordinate with utilities in advance. We had a webinar earlier this week where we talked to a DOT, a utility, and a utilities commission. And they had some advice for kind of what things that states could do to maybe streamline the process a little bit, maybe highlighting areas where there was, green, like we think there's enough grid capacity here. We've talked to the utility. Yellow, it seems like this could be a challenge, or red, like you may want to revisit this in a couple of years. Are you doing anything in Colorado and Pennsylvania to help station developers understand where there may be more suitable locations than others?
Short answer, Steve, is no. We do have 53 electric utilities in Colorado, and the information about grid capacity, where there's close and cost-effective access to three-phase power, is really going to be something that each of the utilities has information on. I think there's probably more we can do to support this dialogue. So I think that's certainly a takeaway for me. Really love the idea of the form that the Pennsylvania team has put together, where everybody fills out the same form, so you're getting consistent utility information for each project. So that's I think a best practice that we'll certainly consider. But so far it has been difficult to get really good information about grid capacity up front, though there are some utilities in Colorado that are making this information available proactively. And where we know about that, we do communicate that.
Thanks, Christian.
This is Natasha. I would echo what Christian said. We don't have a map that shows that across our state. We did meet with every single one of our utilities, all of our major players, plus our rural cooperatives. And they really all said that they would do the analysis as projects came in and would be very helpful in doing that analysis per site. But none of them have shared with us publicly any maps that showcase where that is up front.
I guess bottom line is to communicate early and often with your utilities. We've heard that a lot. So definitely something that we try to encourage as well. Well, we're nearing the end of our time here. Before we go, any parting words of wisdom from any of you?
I just would encourage folks to be flexible. I think to recognize that this is a rapidly evolving market, and we often need to evolve our approach along with it. That the first solicitation you put out is likely to look different than the third or the fifth or the eighth, because the market is changing, and just to really be comfortable, iterating over time as the market evolves.
I think that's a really great point. I was actually on a call right before this, and someone was already asking me what we were going to change in our next round. And I don't know that we know that answer, but I do think as we put out future rounds, we will be changing and evolving to see where we need to additionally put in infrastructure to support the overall NEVI goals, especially for us, knowing our round one is focused on those AFCs. Once we get past that, what are going to be our priorities and how we're going to incorporate changes into that will be a great learning lesson.
And I would just add that as a lesson learned that we have in designing NEVI program is to be accommodating to different types of projects and business models. We've gone through great lengths to allow the property owner to be the applicant to have the site host ownership model for charging stations, because it's not just national charging companies that will come in and find a willing site host. And we're also doing the site by the location by location selection. So that way, a small business who owns one property still has the ability to play in the program. We're not requiring people or even having an incentive for multiple locations, because we want to have a level playing ground that even the smaller entities can compete.
Well, thanks again so much, Christian, Natasha, and Colton. We really appreciate you being with us today. I want to encourage all of our participants to visit driveelectric.gov, where we've got a lot of additional resources that can help you in your corridor planning. I've got a few highlighted here right now. The National Renewable Energy Lab has a suite of resources to help evaluate electric vehicle infrastructure deployment. Also some from Idaho National Laboratory, and then some that we've seen from DOTs and MJ Bradley. So again, you can visit driveelectric.gov. We've got a data and tools page that has a lot of resources that are available to support you. Would also encourage you to sign up for our news alerts so you can be informed of future webinars that we have planned. We have one coming up next Tuesday. It's on contracting and procurement considerations for EVSE deployment, where we'll be hearing from the Federal Highways Administration, as well as a utility and a DOT who are going to be talking about some of their experience in the past deploying large-scale charging infrastructure along their highway corridors. So again, thanks so much to Christian, Natasha, and Colton. And we will post a recording of this on driveelectric.gov/webinars. And we look forward to seeing you all on a future webinar. Thanks so much.